Damian. I'm a CEO and co-founder of Form. We're a plant-based nutrition company, but really we like to think of ourselves as a performance company. Nutrition is one way of enabling performance, but there are many, many more. And education is one which is really important to us. So we're very proud to be sponsoring this space today. And we're also very grateful for you being here. We realize there's a lot going on outside where you could be, so we're very happy that you're here with us. We think we have an amazing talk for you this morning. Intermittent fasting is an amazing tool to have in your performance toolbox. That's what we're going to be discussing today. I'm very fortunate to be joined by Adam and Max. Adam, or Dr. Adam Collins, he's our head of nutrition. He's also the director of nutrition courses at the University of Surrey. And helpfully for us, he's a PhD with an area of interest in intermittent fasting. So he's kind of like the perfect person to guide us through some of the science on this topic. Also joined by Max Lowry. He's author of A 2-Meal Day, and through that book and his amazing online community, he's helped, I guess, literally thousands of people transition their diets or their eating regimes to this kind of regime that we're going to talk about today. They'll do some proper introductions in a second, but what we're going to do is we're going to try and talk you through the ins and outs of intermittent fasting. It's a really big and quite complicated topic, so kind of forgive the notes, because I'm going to try and steer us through in a kind of logical fashion, and hopefully we won't get lost on the way, and we'll end up with some time for some questions and answers at the end. So we'll do the introductions, and then we'll crack on. So Adam, do you want to go first?
Good morning, everyone. Yes, it's a different atmosphere here than I'm used to, which is in academia, but I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm Dr. Adam Collins. I'm the program director for the undergraduate and the MSc program of nutrition at Surrey, and we're pleased to be number one in the league tables for teaching nutrition, and we've recently won the Queen's Anniversary Prize for teaching and research in food and nutrition. The first ever university to be awarded that. So I hopefully come with some credentials. As Damian said, my area of interest has always been around energy balance and metabolism, and in particular recently we've been doing some research on intermittent energy restriction, of which intermittent fasting comes under that, and there's various things that we've been doing, various large projects, smaller projects that I can talk to you about in the context of intermittent fasting.
Max?
Yes, hello everyone, thanks for coming. So my name is Max Lowry, and as Damian mentioned, I created the 2-Meal Day, and the 2-Meal Day is, in my opinion, the simplest and most effective method of intermittent fasting. I've got an online community of thousands of people that are losing weight, losing fat, but most importantly, they're transforming their relationship with food, and it's empowering them to not be dependent on sugar, caffeine, or nicotine to fuel them through the day. I've been a personal trainer for 5 years, working one-on-one with clients, hundreds of clients. Now I have many online clients. Previously to that, I worked in finance. So I've done both ends of the health spectrum, and through the unhealthy periods, I learned a lot about myself, but I learned how to optimize my health, my performance, and everything I talk about now is what I've learned through that. So intermittent fasting is one of those methods.
Okay, so we'll crack on, and probably the first thing to understand about intermittent fasting is that although it's kind of very popular and very on trend now, it's not really anything very new. It's been studied for a very long time, mostly from things like religious fasting or people on hunger strikes, this kind of stuff. So there's quite a body of research already behind and backing up the science. So Adam, do you want to kind of give like a basic overview of what the science kind of is? Just how it's arrived to where it is now, and just maybe the difference between intermittent energy restriction and time-restricted feeding, because I think that's something that people get kind of confused on.
Sure. Thanks, David. So I think, like you say, there's a lot of history to intermittent fasting or intermittently restricting calories. And I suppose one main thing that's been around for a long time is this observation in animals that if you energy restrict an animal, particularly rodents and smaller animals, that they end up living longer, that their life is prolonged through energy restriction. So that was one of the fuels for looking at it in humans. And obviously there's been lots of observational studies looking at particular periods of famine, like the Dutch winter famine and post-war famines, as well as things like Ramadan, where you're intermittently energy restricting over a period of the 24 hours. So from that sort of collective work, started to originate studies looking at originally alternate day fasting. So you're eating normal on one day, and then on the other day you're eating nothing. So this alternating between a total fast and normal eating was almost like the first model of intermittent energy restriction. Then that sort of spurned lots of other studies that looked at either alternate day fasting or maybe alternate partial fasting. So you might be eating maybe a few hundred calories a day on that fast. And then that translated into the more popular translation of the 5-2. So instead of doing it every other day, you're doing it 2 days out of 7. And that was obviously popularised by Michael Mosley in that Horizon program. And that really brought it to the fore in terms of the public's perception of it. But the science behind it has been around for a long time. And the science really is based around this premise that you're causing the body to go through a period of not eating for a prolonged period of time. So that fast could be for a period of a whole 36 hours, because it's more than 24 hours, because you have to add on the sleep before and after that 24 hours if you're doing a total fast. Or it could be within a 24-hour period, which I'm going to come on to a bit later in terms of time-restricted feeding.
Okay, so it's really important for us to kind of set that at the beginning, that, you know, there's a strong body of evidence, a strong body of science historically kind of backing up this kind of structure of eating. We try not to call it a diet, because it's not really a diet, it's a way or a pattern of eating. So Max, how, it's a fairly complicated, different structures of eating, but how have you kind of distilled it down to some simple, kind of easy to use methods?
I initially came across intermittent fasting completely by accident. I was traveling and I got myself into a way of eating that was essentially extending my overnight fast to about 16 hours, and I was eating 2 large meals in the evening. Didn't know what I was doing. I felt great doing it. I was actually traveling through South America whilst I did this. I then got back to the UK, went back to eating normally, 3 square meals a day, cooked from scratch. I cook everything. I put on a bit of weight. I felt full all the time. I was lethargic. I then was thinking, what on earth was I doing? Started researching it, realized I was intermittent fasting without realizing it. I then experimented with skipping breakfast straight away, which I was very pessimistic about, because as everyone knows here, breakfast is the most important meal of the day, or so we've been led to believe. But pretty much straight away, I felt so much better. I had far more energy. I stayed lean, or relatively low body fat without even trying. No counting calories. But then over time, I realized that a lot of the intermittent fasting methods, like the 16-8 and the 5-2, they don't promote it becoming a way of life. And this is where I think they fall short, because they focus on the wrong things. So the 5-2, 5 days you're eating, like he actually says eat what you like, which I think can breed unhealthy relationships with food. But on the 2 days, you're restricting calories to 500 or 600 calories. So you're going to feel deprived on those 2 days, there's no doubt about that, and you're counting calories. Then the 16-8, which is basically what the 2-meal day is, but it's focusing on the wrong thing again. You're focusing on a time period, and a lot of people, when they first start doing it, they start counting down the hours until they can eat. And actually, the reason it's become a way of life for me, the reason I am here talking to you, and this is my passion, and this is what I believe in, is because for me, intermittent fasting allows you to listen to your body better. And only when you take the focus away from clocks and calories, and you learn to actually eat when you're hungry. And this is key, and sounds obvious, but we are virtually never eating when we're hungry. We're eating because breakfast is the most important meal of the day. We eat because it's 1 o'clock, we have to have lunch, that's our lunch period. We're eating because we're sad, bored, tired, hungry, angry. So fasting teaches you to understand all those things and to know that they don't necessarily warrant eating, but it also gives you the empowerment, and I use that word empowerment because that is the word that people are using over and over again in our community, is this feeling of empowerment, to not be a slave to meal times, to not be counting down the hours until you can eat. So yeah, through my kind of 5 years of experimentation, I've developed it into the 2-meal day, and I'm really glad that I'm here talking to you guys today, because there is a lot of confusion with intermittent fasting. There's a lot of bad press, because it's not for everyone, and I think you do have to be careful with it sometimes. But if done for the right reasons, in the correct way, it can be so beneficial. And it's not something that you have to do every single day of your life. It just gives you the power to wake up in the morning and think, I don't feel hungry, I'm not going to eat, and that's okay. It's 1 o'clock. Am I hungry? No, it's not. I'm not going to eat, and that is okay. And that's basically why I believe why it's so powerful.
I think there's 2 interesting points there. One about compliance, which is the most important thing with any kind of regime or diet or training schedule that you're doing. Can you actually comply to it over time?
Yeah.
And then
exactly.
2 about reconnecting with actually hunger and how you actually, how you feel. Because so often people eat just out of boredom or different reasons that are nothing to do with the signaling of your hormones in terms of hunger. So hopefully that's given a good overview of actually what intermittent fasting is, but let's talk a bit about why it actually works. The very kind of simple thing is that you're manipulating your body through 2 different states, from being fed to being fasted. Adam, can you talk a little bit about that without maybe going too academic on us?
I'll try not to blast you with science, but
Maybe the stages from when you
Yes,
eat
yes.
through to being fasted.
So I think when you think of having a meal, whether it's a meal or a snack, and you're eating something, then your body goes through a period of phases. So the first phase is your fed state, or what we call your postprandial state. So it takes you up to 4 hours to process, digest and absorb all the things that you've eaten in that meal. So that is 4 hours after that meal has been consumed. Because often people consume things as mixed meals. It's not just pure glucose, you're having things as a complex matrix within that food. So then after that period, you've got another period of up to 6 hours, which is what we call your post-absorptive period. So having absorbed all of that new food, all those new nutrients and fuel, you're then partitioning it, putting it where it needs to be, using some of that as fuel, replenishing some of your stores. So it's only after that post-absorptive period that you are technically in a period of fasting. So if you add that together, that's 10 hours after that meal that you actually enter into a technical fasted state. And this is where a lot of people get confused, because they think the fasted state is that 4 hours or so after a meal, but actually it's that 10 hours after a meal that you're in that fasted state. Now, if you take someone who's got a typical meal pattern, forgetting snacks in between meals or after meals, say breakfast, lunch and dinner on a typical day. During that typical eating pattern, people are only in the fasted period for literally 2 hours of that 24 hours.
At
4
most.
o'clock in the morning is when they're actually entering into that fasted period. And some people, if they're eating quite late at night, this is assuming that you're not eating anything after, say, 6 o'clock, you're probably never in that fasted period. And some people, if you're eating regularly, are often not even in the post-absorptive period. They're constantly in a period of postprandial state. So that's one of the real benefits or the effects of doing some form of intermittent fasting or energy restriction, whether that's cutting it out for a whole 24 or 36-hour period, or cutting it out for a meal, or a certain window of time to allow your body to enter across those different phases. So that's really the premise of meal transition.
Thank you. And then Max, how does that look like in a typical day then for you, for example?
Yeah, so I get asked this all the time. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I am aiming for roughly a 16-hour fast, but sometimes it's a bit less, sometimes it's a lot more. I kind of just listen to my body. So, for me personally, basically at your 2-meal day journey, if you just decided that you're going to do it, you need to decide whether you're going to skip breakfast or you're going to skip dinner. I choose to skip breakfast. Most people do, because I think it's easier to implement socially. And also, a lot of the benefits for me from fasting are having more energy and feeling less lethargic, and mental clarity are better served during the day for me personally. So I usually finish eating around 8 o'clock, and that's purely because I'm quite aware of how how food can disrupt your sleep. and your circadian rhythm. I sleep much better, and then I usually break my fast around 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon next day, so it's around 16, 17 hours. I choose to do it every single day. Initially, if you're trying to get fat loss results from the plan, then yeah, do it every day. But it's something you can incorporate into your life over a long period of time, and don't be strict with it. I think that's key. But I think the main thing that people have difficulty with initially is getting used to that feeling of having an empty stomach. And this is what you were just kind of explaining. We are afraid of having an empty stomach. And there's a few reasons for this. I think psychologically, fundamentally, we should fear having an empty stomach. But I think a lot of it is actually socially. We are guilted into having breakfast in the morning. We're on a plane for an hour and there's a snack cart going. People are really afraid. But actually, having an empty stomach doesn't actually mean that you're hungry. This is actually what people need to get their head around. We are not meant to have constantly full stomachs all the time. So once you get used to that feeling of having an empty stomach and knowing that you don't necessarily have to have food to function at a high level, it's incredibly empowering.
Okay, thank you. And then Adam, I mean, we see a lot in the press and so on about the various benefits of intermittent fasting, but what's the most kind of robust research in terms of the benefits? I mean, I've seen interesting studies in terms of spontaneous energy reduction. People assume if you skip breakfast, then maybe you'll end up eating more in the afternoon, when actually the science says not. If you take two groups of people, the people that skip breakfast actually end up eating less later on in the day, which is really interesting. What else is there in terms of the science that's interesting in this regard?
Yeah, and I think you're right. And the first thing, and I suppose that's been a big focus of the effects of a 5-2 diet, because anything about diet obviously implies that a majority of people are using it as a way of losing weight or changing body composition. But from even the early studies on intermittent fasting, the observation is that even though you might think that, you're restricting everything over a whole 24 hours, that you just overeat on the days that you do eat to compensate for the fact you haven't had anything to eat on that fast day. And the evidence suggests that not only do you not, it's almost impossible for you to compensate for the amount that you're not eating on that fast day, or even that meal that you've skipped, that actually people spontaneously eat less even on the fed days compared to what they were eating before. So it's having an effect, and maybe it's in terms of in training that person to be able to better regulate their appetite, better regulate their energy intake. So it's not just a case of, you skip a meal and then you just compensate by eating the equivalent or more of that meal over the subsequent meals. And that's evidence from breakfast skipping as well. I mean, we've been brought up with this idea you can't skip breakfast because that's the important meal of the day. But even though you might end up eating slightly more, if you do skip breakfast, it's still a hell of a lot less than the amount of calories you're skipping in the breakfast itself, because you actually removed a whole meal. And that's the effect that was from the group in Bath. So James Betts has done a lot of work on that in Bath. And I know I've talked to him on occasions about it. We've had some collaborative work with them in terms of circadian effects of that. But the bottom line is that whatever form of intermittent fasting you're doing, you don't necessarily overcompensate on the days that you're feeding on the meals that you're feeding. So from a weight loss point of view, it's a way of getting people to eat less food, which obviously gets them to lose weight. But that's only one benefit of intermittent fasting, because the more interesting thing, certainly for us, is independent of that weight loss, you have other metabolic benefits potentially of doing that intermittent energy restriction, which are all down to the fact that you're transitioning between a fed and a fasted state much more than you would be on a normal way of eating. And I can go into that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to cover. I think that maybe, and if there's anything on longevity, because I think longevity is an area that's becoming quite interesting now, especially as I get older.
Longevity is an interesting one, which is good to show in animals, because they don't live very long, but difficult to show in humans that could live for a century or more. So the evidence there doesn't really hold at the moment for humans, but the logic is sound in the sense that some of the metabolic effects, the cellular effects that you get from intermittent energy restrictions on things like IGF-1, growth hormones, oxidative stress, and even cellular differentiation, DNA repair, are things that have potential to have anti-aging or perhaps influencing longevity. But we can't see the end point because there's lots of reasons why people die and maybe die prematurely, not to do with necessarily intermittent energy restriction. So in animals, you can look at it. In humans, it's an interesting premise. It's probably not going to do you any harm, may do you benefit, but we can't prove it.
Okay. And then one thing that a lot of people use alongside intermittent fasting is kind of fasted cardio. Do you want to talk a little bit about the science there and the rationale behind that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work on timing of feeding, particularly carbohydrate around exercise. And I know that James Morton's group and John Hawley in Australia have done a lot of work on training with low carbohydrate or training in a depleted state. And the premise is that if you're putting that stress of exercise in a situation where that muscle is already depleted of fuel, because it's not full up with glycogen, then actually you amplify the cell signaling and the adaptation to that exercise, which is effectively what training is. It's a response to the stress of exercise. If you can amplify that response, you can actually get better benefits from that exercise. So we've looked at it in terms of that model of timing around exercise, and what we've looked at is whether that's the same in men and women, because a lot of the work on training low has been done on males, and a lot of exercise studies tend to be done on males because sports science students tend to be male. So we looked at whether there is a gender difference, and what we've identified is that we know that men and women don't exercise in the same way. That women are better at burning fat during exercise than men. Men are predominantly carbohydrate burners. So actually men deplete their carbohydrate more during exercise and actually have to aggressively replace it after exercise. So they switch to burning fat post-exercise more pronounced than women. So training low in men is very good. But for a woman, if you train low in a woman, you still get some effect. But actually the biggest impact of feeding around exercise is if you feed incorrectly in the post-exercise period. Because if you dump lots of carbohydrate immediately after exercise, you can blunt that switch to burning fat. Because you can overload them with carbohydrate. They don't need as much carbohydrate. They don't need to aggressively replace that carbohydrate in the same way as men do.
I think this is a big topic. I think we're going to be writing about this on our blog,
this is
actually.
A big area that no one's really looked at because no one's really distinguished differences between men and women. But it makes perfect sense. Why should we be giving the same advice to men and women? Because they're not the same. Physiologically, metabolically, there's differences between them. So that's another nuance of intermittent energy restriction or timing of energy around exercise.
Okay. And then Max, from a practical perspective, what benefits have you seen personally and with your clients and customers? I mean,
with fasted exercise?
Fasting in general and fasted exercise.
Well, the thing with fasted exercise is I think it is fairly complicated. I get asked about it all the time, and I think people think if I train fasted, I'm going to lose more weight, and I don't think there's any research anywhere to suggest that necessarily. I think that, like you said, there has been research to suggest that it makes you more metabolically efficient. So for me personally, what that means is I'm using the right fuel source for the right exercise intensity. For example, if I'm going about my day-to-day activities, I'm doing one of my long-distance hikes, I'm doing slow, steady-state cardio, fat can be a better fuel source. But if you're constantly eating carbohydrates before those activities, you won't ever use the fat that's there. Whereas for higher intensity activities like sprinting, Olympic weightlifting, things like that, carbohydrates can definitely help with performance. It's not to say that you can't do it, it's just to say that your performance might be worse than if you hadn't eaten. So it's a fairly complicated thing. There's no one size fits all. It completely depends on what your goals are. I personally prefer to train with an empty stomach because I feel better. I use Form Nutrition Boost because I'm very sensitive to caffeine and I get an amazing rush off that. But the benefits from fasting, I think in practical terms, that I normally focus on three things, because there's a lot of nitty-gritty research going on with the longevity and all the and autophagy and things like this. But actually, you're not really going to feel those on a day-to-day basis. The things that you're going to feel on a day-to-day basis, number one, you're going to potentially lose weight. Or more specifically, you're going to lose fat, which is it's a good thing, and why most people get into intermittent fasting. But actually, the thing that keeps people fasting and incorporating it as a way of life is the fact that you have more energy and you feel less hungry, which is, it sounds completely counterintuitive, because a lot of people are always saying you need food for energy, you need to constantly stoke your metabolism, your energy levels. If I don't eat, I'm ravenous. Of course, if you've tried skipping breakfast and you're someone that eats breakfast every single day of your life, you're going to feel starving, you're going to have no energy. Once you have got your body into this fat-burning state, you will feel less hungry, because you kind of, I don't know if the science of this, but for me personally, you stop associating food with energy. Maybe this is a subconscious thing, but you're not constantly reaching for food, because fat, in my opinion, is a more sustainable fuel source for day-to-day activities. And the reason you have more energy is because you're not having highs and lows from the carbohydrates that you're burning. You're tapping into your stored body fat. And I worked this out the other day, and I think this is quite a good thing for you guys to visualize. I have roughly 8% body fat, which equates to about 8 kilograms of fat dispersed throughout my body. You can tell me if I'm right or wrong here, but half a kilogram of fat is roughly the same as 3,500 calories in terms of energy. Is that right? So if you do the maths, I've got roughly 60,000 calories worth of energy to tap into in the form of fat. And I have a low body fat. So if you have more body fat, obviously there's more energy to tap into. So I want you guys to understand that once you are using that fat for fuel, you feel less hungry and you have more energy. And there's also things, I think, like norepinephrine is released, which makes you feel, which has a direct effect on your mental alertness. So I'm fasted right now. I walked in, I saw lots of amazing food. But actually, whenever I'm doing a talk, even if it's at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I will be fasted, because I am so much clearer in my thinking. It's an amazing thing, and there's been shown, people call it a buzz that you get from fasting, and it's a great thing. So the combination of losing fat, feeling less hungry, and having more energy is really empowering. You can do what you want with that afterwards, You understand your body so much better. And this is why, it's not just me, all over the world, intermittent fasting is becoming, or it's being brought back into the mainstream, because like you mentioned earlier, it's nothing new. Every ancient religion and culture has used fasting in some way, shape or form. This whole eating 3 square meals a day thing is relatively recent. It's like 500, 600 years old. And I just started questioning that, and I wondered where that came from, and is that right and is that wrong? Who says that I have to have breakfast? And actually, people often confuse when I say this. I do eat breakfast, but I eat it at 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Breakfast is breaking your fast. I break my fast just later than everyone else. So losing weight, having more energy, and feeling less hungry is incredibly empowering.
Okay. So I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. So I think what's probably important is to try and kind of summarize it into kind of maybe 4 or 5 kind of easy tips for someone who's kind of walked in and suddenly thought that maybe this is something they would like to try. So Max, do you have kind of like 5 tips or 5 points that would be like the key things to start with?
So I kind of have 2 answers to this question, because you could just go and not have breakfast tomorrow and see how you feel. But if you are someone that knows you have been eating regularly throughout your life, you tend to crash if you don't have a meal, it's normally better to ease into it. So the first thing that I would say, and especially, I'm making the assumption here that you guys like cooking, I don't know, just because of where we are. I would say to someone that had never heard of intermittent fasting, that maybe doesn't have a great relationship with food, doesn't cook, the number one thing that you need to do, and this is often forgotten and where other intermittent fasting methods don't, where they fall short, is that you have to be eating real food, whole foods cooked from scratch. Because it's only when you're nourishing your body properly will you realize that you don't need to eat every 5 minutes. Because if you're eating food-like products that have been created by scientists to make you as addicted as possible, that don't contain any nutrients, you're going to feel hungry all the time. So once you're cooking from scratch from fresh ingredients, maybe you're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, the first thing that you should do is cut out those snacks in between the meals. because they're unnecessary. Of course, you can have, there are good snacks and bad snacks, but we don't need to be eating grazing throughout the day. Once you've cut those snacks out, then rather than waking up first thing in the morning and having breakfast straight away, wait 2 hours, wait an hour, see how you feel. Gradually incorporate longer fast. And then it should get to the stage where you just understand your body better. It's difficult for me to say how long that's gonna take. It's individual, it's personal for everyone. Everyone's completely different. But once you understand the difference between what hunger actually is and what hunger isn't, I know what hunger isn't, but it's very difficult for me to put into words what hunger is. But once you start doing it, you do understand it. Then you can incorporate it into your life how you see fit. But number one thing is that you're not trying to calorie restrict when you are eating, and the foods that you're eating are whole, cooked from scratch, nourishing your body properly.
Okay. So I think we're kind of going to wrap it up there and move to questions from you. Probably the couple of things that you need to know if you want to get more information is, one, you can buy Max's book in all good bookshops. And two, we have a free email course on intermittent fasting written by Dr. Adam Collins and myself. It's available on our website, formnutrition.com. It's completely free. If you go to the Learn section, you can just sign up, and it comes over the course of 6 days. It's about 1,000 words by email per day. Sign up, and it goes through roughly the structure that we've talked about here, but probably in a lot more detail. It will give you a great understanding. So do we want to do some questions? Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Yeah. For me personally, I mean, you'll probably have a different answer for this. I mean, macronutrients, we don't really know what is optimum for anyone. I mean, everyone is going to have different macronutrient profiles that's going to suit them better. For me personally, I prefer eating predominantly low carbohydrate, but I do eat more carbohydrates than I did because of the amount of exercise that I did. So I think there's no right or wrong answer to that. It comes down to your personal preference and how the macronutrients affect you better. I feel really good from eating high fat, moderate protein, low carb, but that won't necessarily work for you. But I think Adam probably has a good answer in terms of the research that's been done with carbohydrates and the timing of that.
But I think it also depends very much on goals, right? What
Yeah.
are you doing? Are you training hard, trying to gain muscle mass? Are you an athlete trying to run quicker? Are you trying to lose fat? All of this kind of works into your macronutrient profile. But Adam, what's the science say?
Well, it's quite timely you asked that question, because literally we've just number crunched the study that we've been doing as a follow-on to the one that we did that appeared on the BBC beginning of this year, to look at carbohydrate timing across the day. And what was interesting is, I mean, the key premise of what we did was to look at patterning carbohydrate across the day. So you're not having carbohydrate in every meal, you're having periods where you have lots of carbohydrate and periods where you've got low carbohydrate. So we were looking at peaks and troughs of carbohydrate across the day. And what we're interested in is, where should you have your peak carbohydrate? Should you have it in the morning? Should you have it in the evening? And what was interesting is that it's coming out that actually having all your carbohydrates in the morning is worse than having them in the evening. And there's a few reasons why that might be. One is that if you think about what people have for breakfast, if they are having breakfast, is that they tend to have a fairly small meal. Although it might be carbohydrate rich, it's actually probably about a quarter of their daily intake at breakfast. So it's not the big meal of the day. The other thing that happens is that when you wake up after being asleep, your insulin levels are at their lowest. Your liver has actually started to export carbohydrate out into the blood. So you've already got some carbohydrate floating around ready for you to wake up and start your active day. So if you put lots of carbohydrate in there, you could actually overload the system at that time of the day. Whereas if you had it in the evening, and in our meal pattern, when they had their carbohydrate in the evening, they had high carbohydrate dinner, followed by a low carbohydrate breakfast and a moderate lunch. So when you think of that pattern, they've got the whole of the evening, and they've got effectively till lunch until they've had get another significant amount of carbohydrate. So even though your insulin sensitivity is lower in the evening, you've got a longer period of time to actually deal with that carbohydrate. Whereas if you have it in the morning, you're always playing catch up, because your then subsequent meal, your lunch, is then another load of carbohydrate, and then you're not until dinner until you're starting to reduce that carbohydrate down. So in answer to your question, macronutrients are important, and the important thing is the carbohydrate, because that's the thing that's really driving that transition, like I said, from the fasted to the postprandial to the post-absorptive state. It does depend on your training. So if you are exercising and you're doing high intensity exercise and you want to perform, then you might want to have carbohydrate before that. If you want to recover, you want to have carbohydrate afterwards. It all depends around that. But the bottom line, I think, on our study is that actually don't have carbohydrate all the time, because you can actually do a form of intermittent energy restriction or intermittent fasting by still eating, but just modifying your carbohydrate across the day.
Yeah. So that's a whole other topic, kind of cyclical kind of carbohydrate diet.
Yeah, that's carbohydrate restricted feeding.
Yeah.
That's another
next year. Next year at Balance we'll do that.
Yeah, that's another story.
Do we have another question? Do you want to wait for the mic? I think we've got a mic now, which will help you. Sorry. Okay, and then this lady here next. Okay. Sorry.
Just following on from what you were saying about the female side of things, if you're training, is it beneficial then to eat fat after you've trained, if you're depending on what type of training you're doing?
I wouldn't say that you have to eat fat, because you're never going to run out of fat, as Matt says. So
a lot there.
It's an infinite supply of fuel, so you don't need to supply fat, but obviously you don't want to put carbohydrate in there, because again that's the trigger of the blunting, so that's what's going to blunt your fat burning. So you could use protein instead, so you could that might serve as a recovery for other reasons. So again,
vegan protein
as a protein source, or you can still have carbohydrate but just don't have it immediately after exercise. So wait, say 90 minutes or so until you've otherwise you're going to blunt that afterburn effect. I'm sure you've all heard of afterburn. That afterburn effect of exercise has nothing to do with burning calories, it's to do with burning fat. And the reason why you burn fat is to replenish the carbohydrate you've used during that exercise. Because why would you want to burn calories extra after just burning loads of calories? Well, it makes sense to burn fat, your unlimited source, to replace your finite source of carbohydrate. So if you think of it like that, that works. So I think if you're not having any carbohydrate, it's not so precious, but if you are having carbohydrate, then wait an hour to 2 hours after that exercise. I mean, the message that was misunderstood when we did it for the media was that women were thinking that they had to eat before exercise. They had to have some carbohydrate before the exercise, which is not the message. The message is don't dump loads of carbohydrate in after exercise. So you can still exercise fasted, but you also need to recover fasted as well in that immediate period.
Okay, the next question is the lady there.
From what you've said, most of the benefits of intermittent fasting seem to be around energy and weight loss. I'm more interested from the point of view of absorption of nutrition and detoxing, which you haven't mentioned a lot about, which in my experience of working with older people, that's what gets weaker as we get older. You know, I know some people accumulate fat, but I lose body fat quite quickly.
Right.
So,
And muscle muscle atrophy is probably the other thing as well.
I haven't noticed that one yet.
Sorry, I don't mean you.
But I agree. When you work, but gestures. So I'm more interested in sort of skin health, other aspects of general well-being, and how you take the pressure of the internal organs, perhaps by fasting.
I mean, I think maybe you have more answers with the actual research, but what I can give you is anecdotally with my community group is you know, yes, they're losing weight, they've got more energy, but actually all sorts of different things seem to be improving. You know, digestive issues seem to clear up, which, you know, if you think about it, makes sense. You're giving your digestion a break. And I think a lot of people here are now beginning to understand that your gut health, your gut bacteria is indicative of overall health. So anything that you can do to allow your gut to replenish is a good thing. And obviously intermittent fasting can be used. But also things like psoriasis is cleared up in people, whether that's the fasting or the fact that they're eating home food cooked from scratch is another story. But yeah, I think I haven't come across any, you know, real research that says, you know, fasting can improve immune system or skin or digestion, but anecdotally, it seems to have that effect for some people. Yeah.
Well, I think probably the big thing is when people move to this kind of eating regime, they generally start eating better food as well. So they probably stop eating ready meals and start cooking a piece of fish and some broccoli, right? And that's going to have a benefit as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think all you were saying there is absolutely correct. I think the literature, the evidence is in its infancy around that, and obviously there's potential to look at things like the effect on the microbiota, the gut microbiome. So my guess would be that it's only going to be a benefit to that because you're actually allowing your body to better transition between those states. We've mainly focused on our research in terms of the postprandial handling. So what we look at is how you tolerate giving people a meal. So how do you respond to eating? And what happens, one of the metabolic effects of intermittent energy restriction is that you're much more efficient at absorbing and partitioning and using those fuels that you're taking in those meals. So from a health perspective, from a metabolic health perspective, you're much better at clearing lipids from the blood, from fat from the blood, carbohydrate from the blood, all of which improves your metabolic health and reduces your risk. And that's what we're particularly interested in because, like I said, it's not about the weight loss, it's about the other metabolic benefits. And the trial that we did, which we published this year, we did a weight loss trial of intermittent energy restriction versus continuous, traditional energy restriction. And we matched for weight loss. So everybody got to a certain amount of weight loss. And then we looked at what the difference between the two groups was, independent of how much weight they lose. Because as soon as you get someone to lose weight, they're better. But can you get additional benefits by losing weight using intermittent energy restriction? And it's not because they lose weight any quicker, it's because they've got better metabolic handling, they're more efficient. Comes back to this whole exercising fasted as well. You've got better fuel management, you're better at managing between carbohydrate and fat. You're better at using your fat stores rather than using carbohydrate all the time, either because you're drip feeding carbohydrate through the meals and snacks that you're having, and that you're slow or not very efficient at clearing that away and then switching to burning fat. That's really the message. It's about what we call metabolic flexibility.
Yeah.
That's what it's all about, managing carbohydrate and fat.
I think we have time for one more question. Do we have? It's the lady here right in front of you.
Oh, there's two.
Hi, I just wondered whether there had been any research on fasting for children.
For children, probably not, because ethically it's difficult to get approval or a favourable opinion to do studies in children. Obviously there's been interest on ketogenic diets in children in terms of behavioural effects. Now whether that could be a justification to advocate doing intermittent energy restriction or some form of that type of diet regime in children, possibly, but I don't know of any studies that have done that in children.
Yeah, and whether it's sort of safe for children. Like with my own kids, I could find it quite difficult to stop them eating, but whether there is a benefit in terms of their energy levels and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what I would say is that as a research, advocating it as an intervention, you probably would struggle to justify that. But if you are a parent, like I am, and you're concerned that actually your kids have skipped a meal, should you be concerned? And the answer is no.
Thank you.
As long as they're eating good food.
Yes.
But you know, yeah.
But if that means that they're then going to eat a whole bowl of Haribo afterwards, not so good.
One more. Okay, I think we've got one more question, one more. Oh, here we go, the guy with the glasses over here.
I was just wondering if you've done any work with like cortisol levels and serotonin levels, rather than just talking about fat loss and weight loss, what's happening hormonally, and is there a link with cutting carbs out to depression, and looking at the negative effects?
We haven't looked at cortisol in the studies that we've done. I think what's more interesting about cortisol, and I suppose it does cross over into intermittent energy restriction, is related to circadian effects on cortisol secretion and how meal timing, particularly if you look at time-restricted feeding, how that might affect cortisol secretion. I mean, cortisol is an interesting one because it's complicated, the action of cortisol, because it depends on other things that are there at the time as to what the action of that cortisol is. So just looking at changes in cortisol alone doesn't tell you the full picture. But it's definitely something of interest because it crosses over into the metabolic effects and partitioning of things into adipose tissue and so on. So it's definitely on our radar.
I mean, I don't know if I'm correct in this, maybe you can correct me, but you were saying how we're less good at dealing with carbohydrates in the morning. Is that something to do with the fact that cortisol is higher in the morning naturally, and that can cause insulin resistance, can't it?
It can do, but again, this is where it starts to become a little bit complicated, because if you have cortisol and insulin combined, then actually that enhances some of the clearance of that carbohydrate from the blood.
Okay.
On top of that, the action of that cortisol is affected by circadian rhythm, and that circadian rhythm is different in different tissues. So the action of that cortisol is going to be different at that particular time of day in your visceral fat as it is in your subcutaneous fat. So nutrition is complicated. When you start delving into it, it's not as clear-cut as you think. So when you listen to people and they think it's very black and white, don't necessarily believe it, because it's very complicated.
I think that's the one takeaway, is basically, as I hope we've shown with Adam, kind of the more experience and the more qualifications and the more research you've read, the more you answer questions about nutrition with the answer, it depends. And it's kind of like the less you know, they're the people that seem to have all the definitive answers, and actually it's such a complex science. But thank you so much for being with us. We're really grateful you took the time to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.